Few nations have fought harder for independence and paid a steeper price than Cuba. From the ashes of colonialism to the roar of the 1959 revolution, from decades of embargo to blackout-era despair, Cuba has spent more than a century defying outside control and living with the consequences. But in the face of growing protests, economic collapse, and a generation that's fleeing in record numbers, a new question looms. Was it worth it? Or has the cost of sovereignty finally grown too high? On May 20th, 1902, the United States ended its occupation of Cuba and the Republic of Cuba was born. Prior to withdrawal, Washington had forced Cuba's Constitutional Convention to accept the Platt Amendment. Under its terms, Cuba could not transfer any land to powers other than the U.S. and had to limit its treaty making to U.S.-approved agreements. Most famously, Cuba was compelled to lease Guantanamo Bay to the U.S. for a naval base, a concession that endures to this day. The amendment even granted the U.S. a right to intervene in Cuba for the preservation of Cuban independence, effectively making Cuba a protectorate rather than a fully free nation. In reality, Cuba's early republic operated under Washington's watch. The island's first president, Tomas Estrada Palma, was a naturalized U.S. citizen, and U.S. business interests quickly dominated key sectors like sugar. When Cuban politics threatened U.S. interests, American troops re-entered. The U.S. militarily occupied Cuba twice to quell unrest. To Cuban nationalists, the Platt framework was an affront to their sovereignty, a betrayal of the very independence for which they had fought. In 1933, amid economic depression and political upheaval, Sergeant Fulgencio Batista emerged as a power behind the throne following a coup. The next year, President FDR, seeking better relations in Latin America, abrogated the Platt Amendment as part of the Good Neighbor policy. The U.S. relinquished its formal right to intervene in Cuba in 1934, though it retained its lease on Guantanamo Bay. At last, Cuba had full legal sovereignty on paper, but decades of U.S. influence and support for Cuban strongmen had already set the stage for a nationalist backlash. On January 1, 1959, Cuban guerrillas led by Fidel Castro toppled the dictatorship of Batista. Batista's regime was seen in Washington as a pro-American anti-communist ally, but to many Cubans, Batista's rule symbolized foreign control, corruption, and inequality. Castro's revolution vowed to reclaim Cubans' dignity and sovereignty by rejecting U.S. influence outright. In the revolution's euphoric first week, crowds in Havana cheered the end of what they viewed as decades of servility to Washington. In January 1961, the U.S. broke off diplomatic relations entirely. Then, just a few months later, in April 1961, a CIA-sponsored force of Cuban exiles invaded Cuba at the Bay of Pigs. The invasion failed spectacularly, with Castro's forces capturing over 1,000 attackers. The Bay of Pigs invasion cemented Castro's distrust of the U.S. and pushed Cuba more firmly into the Soviet camp. By 1962, the Cold War tug-of-war nearly ignited a nuclear conflict. After the U.S. imposed its full trade embargo, the Soviet Union positioned nuclear missiles on the island, triggering the Cuban Missile Crisis. For 13 tense days in October, the world stood on the brink of nuclear war. The crisis ended only when Moscow agreed to remove the missiles in exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. From 1962 onward, Cuba was politically free of U.S. dominance, yet economically and diplomatically isolated by Washington. Little did Cubans know how much hardship this would entail in the years ahead. Throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, Cuba doubled down on its sovereign socialist path under Castro. The U.S. embargo tightened over time, with laws like the Cuban Democracy Act and the Helms-Burton Act codifying sanctions and stipulating that the embargo cannot be lifted until Cuba transitions to a multi-party democracy and free market system. Cuban leaders viewed such terms as unacceptable infringements on national self-determination. To Havana, enduring economic pain was preferable to returning to the days of dependency. By the 80s, Cuba's isolation in the Western Hemisphere was near total. Yet the government touted social achievements, like high literacy rates and universal healthcare. But still, cracks were showing. Tens of thousands of disillusioned Cubans fled by boat during episodes like the 1980 Mariel boat lift. Those who stayed continued to live under one-party rule, tight media censorship, and food ration books. A life far from comfortable, but, as the government insisted, proudly sovereign. But, in 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union plunged Cuba into an economic apocalypse. Overnight, Cuba lost billions in annual subsidies, oil shipments, and its primary trading partner. The 1990s crisis, officially termed the Special Period in Time of Peace, was characterized by severe deprivation. Cuba's GDP plummeted by roughly 35% in just a few years, and imports and exports shriveled by over 80%. Food became scarce. People endured extreme rationing of basics like rice, beans, and cooking oil. Gasoline all but disappeared, forcing a shift to bicycles and ox-drawn plows. The The special period was the ultimate test of Cuba's commitment to sovereignty. With the U.S. embargo still in full force and no aid from Moscow, Cuba's socialist leadership refused to surrender its economic model. By the late 1990s, relief came from new allies. Oil-rich Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, began supplying cut-rate petroleum, and renewed ties with post-Soviet Russia brought investments. These lifelines, along with the resilience of the Cuban people, pulled Cuba slowly out of the worst of the crisis. But as the 21st century dawned, some hoped that a thaw in U.S.-Cuba relations might ease Cuba's burden without sacrificing its autonomy. After 5 decades of hostilities, a historic opportunity to normalize relations arrived in the 2010s. In December 2014, U.S. President Barack Obama and Cuban President Raul Castro announced they would restore full diplomatic ties between their countries. The following year, embassies reopened in Havana and Washington, and travel and remittance restrictions were relaxed. For many Cubans, these moments brought a surge of hope, a sense that perhaps Cuba could have both sovereignty and economic relief. However, this thaw was short-lived. In 2017, a new U.S. administration reversed much of the thaw. President Trump imposed a raft of new sanctions on Cuba and redesignated the country as a state sponsor of terrorism. The Cuban government, now led by President Miguel Diaz-Canel, dug in its heels. The brief dream of a friendly U.S.-Cuba relationship had evaporated. A sense of delusionment set in. The outside world was changing, but Cuba seemed stuck in its cycle of resistance and scarcity. In 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic delivered a new blow. Tourism, a critical source of dollars, dried up, and Cuba's government faced its worst economic crisis since the special period. Shortages of food, medicine, and fuel intensified. The Trump administration's extra sanctions added pain. As President Joe Biden took office in early 2021, he signaled some willingness to ease certain restrictions. But before any broader rapprochement could take shape, Cuba's internal crisis would reach a breaking point, complicating any détente. On July 11, 2021, years of pent-up frustration exploded into the largest mass protest Cuba had seen since 1959. That day, thousands of Cubans in cities and small towns across the island took to the streets shouting "Libertad." The government's response was swift and uncompromising. President Diaz-Canel went on national TV to urge loyalists to retake the streets and defend the revolution. By July 13th, the Cuban state had largely quashed the demonstrations through a mix of power outages, police crackdowns, and fear. In the aftermath, Cuba faced another reckoning, an exodus of its people. In fiscal year 2022, U.S. authorities recorded over 224,000 Cuban migrants encountered at the U.S.-Mexico border, the largest wave of Cuban emigration in modern history. The immigration crisis reflected a grim reality. Many Cubans, especially youth, saw no future on the island. Meanwhile, those who remained in Cuba continued to face austere conditions. After more than 60 years of embargo, Cuba's leaders still refuse any solution that involves bowing to U.S. political demands. Instead, the burden of this falls on the Cuban people. In a notable first, Cuba even turned to the United Nations World Food Program in 2023 for emergency assistance in feeding its population, a stark indicator of how dire the situation became. The story of Cuba is a vivid testimony to the idea that political sovereignty can exact a heavy price. It remains to be seen whether the next chapter will continue the saga of stoic endurance, or whether a new generation of Cubans will redefine the social contract that has governed their island for over 60 years. Thanks for watching.